My name is Tobias Rourke, and I'm a pipeline inspector who survived the first week of the zombie outbreak. When the infection spread through contaminated water systems I'd been monitoring, I was trapped 60 miles from civilization with one mission: reach my 12-year-old daughter Emma in Phoenix before the military evacuation left without her. What I discovered about the outbreak's true origin changed everything. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Tobias Rourke, and I'm a pipeline inspector who survived the first week of the zombie outbreak. When the infection spread through contaminated water systems I'd been monitoring, I was trapped 60 miles from civilization with one mission: reach my 12-year-old daughter Emma in Phoenix before the military evacuation left without her. What I discovered about the outbreak's true origin changed everything. I need you to understand something about my job before I tell you what happened that morning. For 12 years, I worked alone inspecting oil and gas pipelines across Texas, North Dakota, and Alaska. I had security clearance to access critical infrastructure that most people never even know exists. My job was to check pressure readings, look for leaks, and make sure America's energy kept flowing. I spent weeks at a time in the middle of nowhere, sometimes hundreds of miles from the nearest town. Most people would go crazy with that kind of isolation, but I preferred it. No office politics, no meetings, just me and the machinery that keeps our country running. The irony is that this isolation, which cost me my marriage and relationship with my daughter Emma, is exactly what saved my life when everything went to hell. While millions of people were dying in cities across America, I was standing next to Pipeline Station 7 outside Midland, Texas, completely alone and completely safe. At least for a few more hours. October 15th, 2024 started, like any other Tuesday. I woke up in my company trailer at 5:30 in the morning, made coffee on my portable burner, and checked the weather forecast on my satellite radio. Clear skies, temperature climbing to 85 degrees. Perfect conditions for pipeline inspection. I had 3 stations to check that day, each one connected to a network of underground pipes that carried crude oil from West Texas refineries to distribution centers across the Southwest. Pipeline Station 7 was my first stop, and it should have been routine. The station sits on a small concrete pad surrounded by desert scrub, with a chain-link fence and warning signs that keep curious locals away. Most people driving past on Highway 349 probably think it's just another piece of industrial equipment they don't need to understand. They have no idea that the pipes running beneath their feet carry the lifeblood of American commerce. I parked my company truck next to the main control panel and started my inspection checklist. Pressure readings looked normal. Flow rates were within acceptable parameters. The automated safety system showed green lights across the board. Everything was working exactly as designed. I should have been finished and moving on to the next station within an hour. But there was something bothering me that morning. Something I'd been trying to ignore for the past 3 weeks. The chemical analysis reports from several pipeline stations had been showing unusual readings. Not dangerous levels, but inconsistent with normal crude oil composition. My supervisor had told me not to worry about it, said the lab equipment probably needed calibration. Standard corporate response when they don't want to spend money on investigation. The thing is, I'd seen these kinds of anomalies before. 2 years ago, a pipeline in North Dakota started showing similar chemical inconsistencies. Management ignored it for 6 months until we had a major spill that contaminated 3 square miles of farmland and cost the company $200 million in cleanup and lawsuits. That's when I learned to trust my instruments more than my supervisors. So that morning at Station 7, I decided to run an additional test that wasn't on my official checklist. I connected my portable analyzer to the secondary sampling port and waited for the results. What I saw made no sense at first. The readings showed trace amounts of compounds that shouldn't exist in crude oil. Organic polymers with molecular structures I didn't recognize. I ran the test 3 more times to make sure my equipment wasn't malfunctioning. Every test came back with the same impossible results. Something was in the pipeline system that didn't belong there, and it was showing up at multiple stations across Texas. I made a note to contact the regional lab when I got back to town, but I figured it was probably just contamination from a refinery upgrade or new chemical additive. Nothing that couldn't wait a few days. I was wrong about that. Dead wrong. At 10:30 that morning, my radio started crackling with emergency broadcasts. At first, I thought it was just another test of the emergency alert system. We got those all the time, usually for severe weather or missing children. But this broadcast was different. The voice was strained, almost panicked, and the words didn't make sense. Mass casualty incident reported in downtown Houston. Emergency services are requesting all available units respond to multiple locations. Reports of individuals attacking civilians in Herman Park and surrounding areas. Repeat, this is not a drill. I turned up the volume and waited for more information. Houston was 300 miles away, but emergency broadcasts could carry much farther than normal radio signals. Within minutes, similar reports started coming from Dallas, then San Antonio, then Austin. Same pattern everywhere. People attacking other people. Hospitals overwhelmed. Emergency services unable to respond to the volume of calls. The first thought that crossed my mind was terrorism. Some kind of coordinated attack using biological or chemical weapons. It would explain the simultaneous outbreaks in multiple cities, but terrorists usually make demands or claim responsibility. These broadcasts mentioned no demands, no manifestos. Just chaos spreading faster than authorities could contain it. I tried calling my supervisor on the company radio but got no response. The emergency frequencies were jammed with overlapping transmissions from police, fire, and medical units. Everyone was talking at once, and none of it made sense. Reports of people who wouldn't stay down after being shot. Ambulances being overrun by the same people they were trying to help. Hospitals evacuating patients because their own staff was being attacked. Then I heard something that changed everything. A National Guard unit in Austin was broadcasting on an open channel, probably by accident. The voice was young, scared, and giving a situation report to his commanding officer. Sir, we have approximately 50 individuals who appear to be infected with some kind of disease. They're not responding to verbal commands or non-lethal force. Several of my men have been bitten, and the medics are saying any bite from an infected person will result in infection within 18 to 24 hours. We need immediate medical evacuation for the wounded and hazmat support for containment. Infected. Bites causing infection. 18 to 24-hour incubation period. The pieces started falling into place, and I didn't like the picture. They were forming. This wasn't terrorism. This was something much worse. Some kind of disease that spread through human contact and turned people into attackers who couldn't be stopped by conventional means. I'd seen enough zombie movies to recognize the pattern, but this was real life. Things like that didn't happen in real life, except they were happening right now in cities across Texas, and I was sitting alone in the desert, 60 miles from the nearest town, with no way to know if the infection was spreading to smaller communities. My portable radio had been monitoring multiple emergency frequencies, but around noon, the transmission started getting weaker and less frequent. Some stations went completely silent. Others devolved into desperate pleas for help that went unanswered. The infrastructure that connected our modern world was breaking down in real time, and I had a front row seat to watch it happen. That's when I made the decision that saved my life. Instead of continuing my inspection route, I packed up my equipment and started driving toward Midland. I needed to find out what was really happening, and I needed to contact my daughter. Emma lived in Phoenix with her mother over 300 miles away. If this infection was spreading as fast as the radio report suggested, she could be in danger. The drive back to civilization should have taken 45 minutes. It took me over 3 hours. Highway 3. 49 was clogged with vehicles heading in both directions. Some people were fleeing the cities while others were trying to get back to find their families. I saw license plates from Houston, Dallas, Austin, and San Antonio. Entire families with their cars packed full of belongings, driving like refugees from their own country. But it was the abandoned vehicles that really scared me. Cars and trucks left in the middle of the road with doors open and engines still running. Personal belongings scattered on the asphalt. No signs of accident or mechanical failure. People had just stopped their vehicles and walked away, leaving everything behind. Or maybe they hadn't walked away voluntarily. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I encountered my first infected person. I was driving slowly through a section of abandoned vehicles when I saw movement in my headlights. A woman in a torn business suit was standing perfectly still between two cars, her back turned to me. She looked like she might need help, so I stopped my truck and rolled down the window. "Ma'am, are you okay? Do you need assistance?" She turned around slowly, and I immediately knew something was terribly wrong. Her face was pale gray with dark veins visible beneath the skin. Her eyes were completely white like cataracts, but she was definitely looking at me. Blood was dried around her mouth and on the front of her jacket. She opened her mouth and made a sound that wasn't quite human, a low moan that seemed to come from deep in her chest. Then she started walking toward my truck. Not running, not stumbling, just walking with deliberate purpose. Her movements were stiff but coordinated, like someone learning to use their body for the first time. I called out to her again, but she didn't respond to my voice. She just kept walking directly toward me, making that horrible moaning sound. I floored the accelerator and drove around her, but she followed my movement with those white eyes. Even as I sped away, I could see her in my mirrors, still walking in the direction I'd gone. She wasn't confused or disoriented. She knew exactly where I was and what she wanted to do to me. That's when I understood that the radio reports were real. The infection was real, and it was spreading faster than anyone could have imagined. I drove as fast as I dared through the maze of abandoned vehicles, constantly checking my mirrors for more infected people. I saw several more over the next hour, all displaying the same behavior. Slow, deliberate movement, complete focus on any living person they encountered, and that horrible moaning sound that seemed to call others of their kind. By the time I reached the outskirts of Midland, the entire city was in chaos. Smoke was rising from multiple locations. I could hear gunfire in the distance, sometimes single shots, sometimes automatic weapons. The emergency sirens that had been wailing all day were starting to go silent one by one. Streetlights were out in many areas, and I realized the power grid was beginning to fail. I needed fuel, food, and a safe place to figure out my next move. The Chevron station on the edge of town looked like it might still be operational. The lights were on, and I could see a pickup truck parked near the building. As I pulled up to, the pumps, 3 people emerged from inside the station. They were armed but not threatening, clearly survivors like myself who had found temporary safety. The oldest of the group was a man in his 50s wearing mechanic's coveralls. He introduced himself as Frank and explained that he'd been the station manager before everything went crazy. The other 2 were a young woman named Sarah, who'd been a nursing student at the local college, and a middle-aged man named Carlos who'd been driving a delivery truck when the outbreak started. Frank had barricaded the station using metal shelving and furniture from the attached convenience store. The building had thick walls, limited access points, and most importantly, it was full of supplies. Fuel, food, water, basic medical supplies, and even some tools and equipment. If you had to pick a place to wait out an apocalypse, a gas station wasn't the worst choice. They'd been monitoring the emergency broadcasts just like I had, but they'd also seen the situation firsthand. Carlos had driven through downtown Midland that morning and described scenes that sounded like something from a nightmare. Hundreds of infected people wandering the streets, attacking anyone they encountered. The hospital had been overrun by noon. Police and emergency responders had either fled or been killed trying to maintain order. Sarah had the most useful information because of her medical training. She'd been in contact with other nursing students across the state before the cell towers failed. The infection spread through bites just like the radio had reported, but it also spread through any exchange of bodily fluids. Scratches, open wounds, even mouth-to-mouth resuscitation could transmit whatever was causing people to turn into those things. The incubation period varied from person to person, but it was never longer than 24 hours. Most people turned within 12 to 18 hours after exposure. The transformation process was described as extremely painful, with high fever, convulsions, and eventually death. But death wasn't permanent. Within minutes of dying, Infected people would reanimate with a single driving compulsion to feed on living human flesh. Frank had seen it happen to his assistant manager earlier that day. The man had been bitten while trying to help a customer who'd seemed disoriented. Frank locked him in the back office when he started showing symptoms, hoping they could find medical help. Instead, they listened to him scream for 6 hours before everything went quiet. When Frank finally opened the door, the man was standing there with those same white eyes, reaching for him with hands that no longer seemed entirely human. As the sun set on October 15th, we watched Midland burn from the windows of our improvised fortress. The city of 140,000 people was dying, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. The radio transmissions had dwindled to occasional desperate pleas for help from isolated survivors, most of which went unanswered. The infrastructure that had taken decades to build was collapsing in a matter of hours. But I couldn't stay there. Somewhere in Phoenix, my daughter Emma was facing the same nightmare that had consumed Texas. Her mother Jennifer would be trying to keep her safe, but they didn't have the advantages I'd gained from years of working in remote locations. They didn't know how to survive when civilization stopped functioning. They needed me, whether Jennifer wanted to admit it or not. The others tried to convince me that leaving the gas station would be suicide. We had supplies, defensible positions, and most importantly, we were still alive. Why risk everything to travel 300 miles through infected territory with no guarantee that Phoenix was any safer than Texas? Because Emma is my daughter, and I'd already failed her too many times. I'd missed her birthday parties because of work. I'd missed her school plays because of pipeline emergencies. I'd missed the chance to be the father she deserved because I thought my job was more important than my family. I wasn't going to miss the chance to save her life. The chemical readings I'd been ignoring for weeks suddenly made terrible sense. The trace compounds in the pipeline system weren't contamination from refinery operations. They were evidence of something much worse. The infection hadn't started in the cities. It had started in the infrastructure that supplied those cities, the water treatment plants, the distribution networks, the very systems I'd been paid to monitor and protect. I'd been watching the outbreak develop for weeks without realizing what I was seeing. The data was right there in my inspection reports, but I'd dismissed it as equipment malfunction. How many people died because I didn't connect the dots in time? How many cities could have been saved if I'd raised the alarm 3 weeks ago instead of filing routine paperwork? The guilt was eating at me, but it also gave me something the others didn't have. I understood how the infection had spread so quickly and efficiently. I knew which infrastructure systems were compromised and which ones might still be safe. Most importantly, I knew routes through industrial areas that most people would never think to use. Routes that might be clear of infected because they didn't follow normal population patterns. Frank, Sarah, and Carlos were good people, and they deserved to survive. But they were thinking like civilians, trying to wait out a temporary crisis until the government restored order. I was thinking like someone who'd spent 12 years maintaining the systems that keep our country running. I knew those systems were failing, and they weren't coming back anytime soon. The woman in the business suit was still walking down Highway 349, probably still making that horrible moaning sound. By now, she'd been joined by others. Hundreds, maybe thousands of infected people shambling through the desert, following some instinct that drew them toward the living. They had all the time in the world, and they would never stop looking for us. But I had something they didn't have. I had knowledge of infrastructure that could get me across 300 miles of infected territory. I had equipment that could overcome obstacles they couldn't even understand. And I had a 12-year-old girl counting on me to be the father I'd never managed to be when the world was normal. The radio was silent now except for static and the occasional automated emergency broadcast that played the same message over and over. This is the emergency alert system. Seek immediate shelter. Avoid contact with infected individuals. Wait for further instructions. But there weren't going to be any further instructions. The people who would have given those instructions were dead or running for their lives just like the rest of us. As I prepared to leave the safety of the gas station and venture into a world that no longer made sense, I realized that everything I'd learned about survival had come from working alone in dangerous places. Now, I was about to put that knowledge to the ultimate test. Emma was waiting for me in Phoenix, assuming Phoenix still existed. The only question was whether I could reach her before the infection reached her first. The infected people weren't just random victims of some unknown disease. They were the result of something I'd been monitoring for weeks without understanding what I was seeing. Something that had spread through the very infrastructure I'd dedicated my career to protecting. And now I was going to use that same infrastructure to cross a continent full of creatures that wanted to kill me. The woman in the business suit was still out there somewhere, walking through the desert night. But she wasn't the only threat I'd have to face on the road to Phoenix. The Chevron station became our world for the next 4 days, and I learned more about human nature in that time than I had in my previous 34 years of life. Frank, Sarah, Carlos, and I developed routines that kept us alive while the world outside our barricaded walls descended into complete chaos. But every hour that passed was another hour closer to losing Emma forever. Frank turned out to be exactly the kind of person you'd want in a crisis. 28 years managing the gas station had taught him to solve problems with whatever materials were available. He'd reinforced our barricades using metal shelving from the convenience store, creating overlapping barriers that would funnel any attackers into kill zones. The man understood defensive positions better than most soldiers I'd met. Sarah brought medical knowledge that probably saved all our lives. She'd completed 2 years of nursing school before the outbreak, which meant she understood infection control, wound treatment, and basic pharmacology. More importantly, she'd been paying attention to the medical reports before the communication networks failed. She knew things about the infection that weren't being broadcast to the general public. Carlos had been a delivery driver for 15 years, which meant he knew every back road, shortcut, and alternative route within 200 miles of Midland. His knowledge of the local area complemented my understanding of industrial infrastructure. Between the two of us, we could navigate around population centers and through areas that most people didn't even know existed. What I brought to the group was something none of them had. 12 years of working alone in remote locations had taught me to think systematically about survival. Not just day-to-day survival, but long-term planning for situations where help isn't coming. I knew how to maintain equipment, generate power, purify water, and most importantly, how to stay calm when everything around you is falling apart. Our first major test came on the second night. We'd been hearing individual infected people wandering past the station throughout the day, but they hadn't shown any interest in our location. We kept the lights off and made minimal noise, hoping to avoid attracting attention. That strategy worked until Carlos made a mistake that almost got us all killed. He'd been checking the perimeter around midnight when he knocked over a display rack of motor oil. The crash echoed through the building and out into the night air. Within minutes, we could hear the moaning sounds approaching from multiple directions. Not just the slow shambling we'd observed before, but coordinated movement toward our position. I counted at least 6 distinct voices in that horrible chorus. 6 infected people who had been wandering aimlessly through the desert until they heard proof that living humans were nearby. Now they were converging on our location with single-minded determination that was absolutely terrifying to witness. Frank and I had prepared for this possibility by creating weapons from materials in the station. Tire irons, crowbars, anything heavy enough to crush skulls. Sarah had insisted that we understand the enemy we were fighting. The infected people retained basic motor functions and problem-solving abilities, but they'd lost everything that made them human. They felt no pain, showed no fear, and would continue attacking until their bodies were physically destroyed. The first one reached our barricade within 10 minutes. A teenage boy wearing a Midland high school football jersey, his face already showing the gray pallor and white eyes that marked the infected. He pushed against our metal barriers with mechanical persistence, testing for weak points. When that didn't work, he started climbing. I hit him with a crowbar as he came over the top, but it took 3 solid blows to the skull before he stopped moving. The sound of metal striking bone was sickening, but there was no alternative. This thing had been a human being 12 hours ago, maybe someone's son or brother. Now it was a biological weapon programmed to kill anything that still drew breath. The other 5 infected people followed the same pattern. Systematic testing of our defenses, then climbing or forcing their way through weak points. We killed them all, but it required coordinated effort and careful planning. A single mistake would have meant infection for one of us, followed by death and reanimation within 24 hours. After that night, we established watch schedules and improved our defensive positions, but More importantly, we started observing the infected people's behavior patterns. Sarah had been right about their retained problem-solving abilities. They could open doors, climb obstacles, and even use simple tools. But they seemed to lose interest in areas where they couldn't detect living humans. I noticed something else during those observations, something that would become crucial information later. The infected people avoided certain areas around the gas station. Specifically, they stayed away from the section where we stored automotive, chemicals, and maintenance supplies. At first, I thought it might be coincidence, but the pattern was too consistent to ignore. There was a drainage ditch about 50 yards from the station where runoff from our automotive service bay collected. The water was contaminated with motor oil, transmission fluid, brake cleaner, and various other chemicals that Frank had been disposing of for years. No infected person came within 20 feet of that ditch even when they were directly pursuing us. This observation reminded me of the chemical anomalies I'd been detecting in pipeline systems for weeks before the outbreak. The trace compounds that didn't belong in crude oil. The organic polymers with molecular structures I couldn't identify. What if those weren't contaminants at all? What if they were evidence of the infection's true origin? I'd been assuming that. The outbreak started in populated areas and spread outward through human contact. But the timing didn't match that pattern. The simultaneous eruptions in Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, and Austin suggested a coordinated source that could reach multiple cities at once. The only system that connected all those urban areas was the infrastructure I'd been monitoring for over a decade. Water treatment plants, distribution networks, pipeline systems that carried not just oil and gas, but also the chemicals used to process municipal water supplies. If someone had introduced biological contamination into those systems, it could explain how the infection spread so quickly and efficiently. It would also explain why certain industrial chemicals seemed to repel the infected people. Sarah confirmed my suspicions when she shared information she'd learned from other medical students before the communication networks failed. The infection didn't just spread through bites and bodily fluids. It could also be transmitted through contaminated water, especially if the victim had any open wounds or compromised immune system. The biological agent responsible for the outbreak was remarkably hardy and could survive in various environmental conditions. This revelation changed everything about our survival strategy. We weren't just dealing with infected people who had to be physically present to pose a threat. We were dealing with contaminated infrastructure that could remain dangerous for weeks or months after the initial outbreak. Every water source, every food supply, every enclosed space could potentially harbor the biological agent that turned humans into mindless killers. Frank had been using bottled water from the convenience store for drinking and cooking, but we'd been using tap water for cleaning and personal hygiene. I immediately shut off the main water supply to the station and started testing our stored water with chemical analysis equipment from my truck. The results were exactly what I'd feared. Low-level contamination that wouldn't be immediately fatal, but could cause infection through prolonged exposure. We had enough bottled water to last maybe 2 more days if we were careful. After that, we'd need to find alternative sources or develop purification methods that could eliminate biological contamination. This was the kind of technical problem I'd been trained to solve, but I'd never imagined applying that knowledge to keep my friends alive during a zombie apocalypse. The radio had been silent for over 24 hours, but on the 3rd night, we picked up a weak transmission from what sounded like a National Guard unit operating somewhere north of Dallas. They were reporting massive infected populations in all major urban areas, complete breakdown of civil authority, and failure of multiple attempts to establish safe zones. The military response had been overwhelmed within 48 hours of the initial outbreak. More importantly for my situation, they confirmed that Phoenix had been evacuated. Civilian authorities were attempting to relocate the entire population to military installations in Colorado and New Mexico. The evacuation was being conducted by air transport from Sky Harbor Airport, but they were running out of time and resources. Priority was being given to families with children, medical personnel, and individuals with critical technical skills. Emma qualified for priority evacuation because of her age, but only if she could reach the airport before the operation was terminated. The guard unit estimated they had maybe another week before the situation became completely untenable. After that, They'd be forced to abandon anyone who hadn't made it to the designated pickup points. I had to reach Phoenix within 6 days, cross 300 miles of infected territory, and somehow get my daughter and her mother to Sky Harbor Airport. Under normal circumstances, that would be a challenging but manageable road trip. With the infrastructure failing and infected people wandering the highways, it seemed almost impossible, but I had advantages that most survivors didn't possess. I knew alternative routes through industrial areas where infected populations would be lower. I understood how to maintain vehicles under adverse conditions. Most importantly, I was beginning to understand the infection's relationship with chemical contamination, which could help me identify safe areas and avoid dangerous ones. Frank, Sarah, and Carlos wanted me to stay at the gas station. We had food, water, fuel, and defensible positions. The infected people were relatively sparse in our area, and we'd proven we could handle small groups. Why risk everything on a dangerous journey with no guarantee of success? Because Emma was my responsibility, and I'd already failed her too many times. I'd chosen work over family for 12 years, missing birthdays, holidays, school events, and countless opportunities to be the father she deserved. I'd told myself I was providing for her future by focusing on my career, but the truth was I'd been avoiding the emotional complexity of parenthood. The outbreak had stripped away all the excuses and rationalizations I'd used to justify my absence from Emma's life. None of my professional achievements mattered now. The pipeline systems I'd spent years maintaining were the very infrastructure that had enabled this disaster. The knowledge I'd gained from working in isolation was only valuable if I used it to protect the people I loved. On the 4th morning, we received a transmission that changed everything. It was weak and intermittent, probably from a handheld radio operating at maximum range. The voice was female, young, and terrified. She was broadcasting from Phoenix, trying to reach anyone who might be listening. "This is Jennifer Rourke calling for Tobias Rourke. If you're out there, please respond. Emma and I are at Sky Harbor Airport waiting for evacuation. The military says they're leaving tomorrow morning with or without the remaining civilians. I know we're not together anymore, but Emma needs her father. Please, if you can hear this, we're in Terminal 4, Gate B12. Please hurry. Jennifer, my ex-wife, the woman I'd loved and lost because I couldn't figure out how to balance work and family. She was calling for me, asking me to be the man I should have been all along. Emma was at the airport, scared and waiting for someone to save her. The evacuation was leaving in less than 24 hours. I had no choice but to leave immediately. The others understood, even though they thought I was making a mistake. Frank gave me extra fuel containers and basic tools. Sarah provided medical supplies and antibiotics. Carlos shared his knowledge of back roads that might still be passable. But as I prepared to leave the safety of our improvised fortress, I realized that I was carrying more than just equipment and supplies. I was carrying the burden of knowledge that could have prevented this disaster, the chemical readings I'd ignored, the contamination patterns I'd dismissed, the infrastructure vulnerabilities I'd failed to report. 12 years of experience had taught me to recognize the signs of system failure, but I'd been looking at the wrong systems. I'd been monitoring pipelines and pressure readings while ignoring the biological contamination that was spreading through water treatment facilities. The infection hadn't started with patient 0 in some hospital. It had started in the infrastructure that supplied clean water to millions of people. Someone had deliberately introduced biological agents into municipal water systems, using the very infrastructure I'd sworn to protect. The trace compounds I'd been detecting weren't contamination from industrial processes. They were evidence of biological warfare conducted through public utilities. The enemy hadn't been foreign terrorists or military forces. The enemy had been working within our own infrastructure, using our systems against us. This knowledge made me valuable to the military authorities conducting the evacuation from Phoenix. I understood how the infection had spread and what systems were still compromised. I could help them identify safe water sources, predict where infected populations would be concentrated, and plan evacuation routes that avoided the most dangerous areas. But first, I had to survive 300 miles of infected territory with limited supplies and no backup support. The woman in the business suit was still out there somewhere, probably joined by hundreds of others just like her. They would all be drawn to the sound of my truck engine, the scent of living human tissue, the promise of fresh victims to feed their insatiable hunger. The sun was setting on October 19th, as I said goodbye to Frank, Sarah, and Carlos. 4 days earlier, we'd been strangers thrown together by circumstance. Now we were family, bonded by shared danger and mutual dependence. I was abandoning that family to chase after the one I'd lost through my own mistakes. Frank pressed a hand-drawn map into my palm, showing alternative routes that avoided major highways. Sarah gave me a final briefing on infection symptoms and treatment protocols. Carlos offered to come with me, but I couldn't ask him to risk his life for my personal mission. These people had their own survival to worry about. As I drove away, from the Chevron station, I could see infected people in my headlights, more of them than we'd encountered during our 4-day siege, shambling through the desert with that horrible mechanical persistence. They turned toward my truck as I passed, following my movement with those terrible white eyes. Some of them started walking in my direction, drawn by the sound and vibration of the engine. The infection was spreading faster than we'd realized. What had been isolated individuals on October 15th was becoming organized groups by October 19th. They were learning to hunt in packs, coordinate their movements, and communicate through that awful moaning sound. Evolution in real time, driven by the need to feed on living human flesh. I had 20 hours to cross 300 miles of increasingly dangerous territory, 20 hours to reach my daughter before she was evacuated to safety without me. 20 hours to prove that I could be the father she needed when it mattered most. The radio was silent except for static. The highways were full of abandoned vehicles and the infected people were everywhere. But I knew things about infrastructure and chemical contamination that could keep me alive. I knew routes through industrial areas where the infected people were less likely to congregate. I knew how to identify safe water sources and avoid biological hazards. Most importantly, I knew that Emma was counting on me to overcome impossible odds and reach her before it was too late. The gas station disappeared in my rear-view mirror, but I could still see the glow of Frank's emergency lights through the desert darkness. 3 good people who'd trusted me with their lives for 4 days, now left to defend themselves while I chased personal redemption. I hoped they would survive long enough for me to return with help from the military evacuation force. Assuming I lived long enough to reach Phoenix at all. The first 50 miles out of Midland taught me that everything I thought I knew about the infection was wrong. The isolated individuals we'd encountered at the gas station were nothing compared to what was happening on the major transportation routes. Interstate 20 was completely impassable, clogged with thousands of abandoned vehicles and infected people who moved between them like scavengers picking through a massive graveyard. I'd planned to use Highway 137 as my primary route toward Lubbock, but that became impossible within the first hour of driving. The small towns along that corridor had been completely overrun. Stanton, Greenwood, Midkiff, every community that should have been a potential safe haven or resupply point was now crawling with infected people who congregated around any sign of recent human activity. This wasn't random distribution. The infected people were following patterns that suggested they retained more cognitive ability than we'd realized. They gathered around grocery stores, gas stations, hospitals, anywhere that survivors might logically seek shelter or supplies. It was like they remembered enough about human behavior to predict where living people would go, then waited there with endless patience for victims to arrive. Carlos had been right about the back roads, but even those were becoming dangerous. Farm-to-market roads that should have been empty were littered with infected people who'd wandered away from population centers. Some were still wearing the clothes they'd died in, business suits and hospital scrubs and school uniforms. Others were so decomposed that their original identity was impossible to determine. The decomposition process was another thing that didn't match what we'd expected. Instead of normal decay, the infected people seemed to be preserved by whatever biological agent had reanimated them. Bodies that should have been skeletal after a week were still mobile and dangerous. The infection wasn't just controlling dead tissue, it was maintaining it in a functional state indefinitely. I made better progress using the network of service roads that connected oil field installations across West Texas. These roads weren't marked on normal maps, but I'd been driving them for 12 years. They followed pipeline corridors and connected wellheads, pumping stations, and maintenance facilities that most people didn't even know existed. The infected, people hadn't discovered these routes yet because they were following human traffic patterns, not industrial infrastructure. My first major obstacle came near La Mesa, where I encountered a group of survivors who'd had the same idea about avoiding main highways. They'd set up a roadblock using overturned vehicles and were demanding fuel and supplies from anyone trying to pass through their territory. 5 men with hunting rifles and the kind of desperate aggression that develops when civilization disappears overnight. The leader was a man in his 40s wearing camouflage clothing and a military-style haircut. He might have been National Guard or just someone who liked to play soldier on weekends. Either way, he'd decided that controlling a strategic intersection gave him the authority to tax other survivors for safe passage. "This road is under our protection," he announced when I stopped my truck. "Cost of passage is half your fuel and whatever food you're carrying. Non-negotiable." I explained that I was trying to reach Phoenix before the military evacuation departed, that my daughter was waiting at the airport, that I had technical knowledge that could help the authorities understand how the infection had spread. None of that mattered to them. They'd found a choke point they could control, and they were going to exploit it for everything they could get. The thing about roadblocks is that they only work if you're committed to using the roads they're blocking. I had detailed knowledge of alternative routes that bypassed their position entirely, pipeline maintenance roads that connected to ranch access routes that eventually rejoined the highway system, miles beyond their little kingdom. But these men represented something I was going to encounter more frequently as the crisis continued. The breakdown of civil authority wasn't just creating opportunities for infected people to spread. It was also revealing the worst aspects of human nature among the survivors. People who'd been law-abiding citizens a week ago were now willing to threaten other survivors for resources and territory. I gave them one of my spare fuel containers and some canned food from the gas station, then took their alternative route information and drove away. It wasn't worth fighting over, and I needed to conserve ammunition for more serious threats. But I made note of their location and planned to report it to military authorities when I reached Phoenix. If there was still a functioning government, after this crisis, those men would have to answer for their actions. The detour cost me 3 hours and 20 miles of additional driving, but it taught me valuable lessons about navigating through a collapsed society. Official routes were compromised by both infected people and hostile survivors. The key to making progress was using infrastructure that both groups ignored or didn't understand. Industrial roads, utility corridors, agricultural access routes that connected to each other in ways that weren't obvious from surface maps. I reached Lubbock around midnight on October 19th, and the city was like nothing I'd ever seen. Entire neighborhoods were on fire with no one fighting the blazes. Streetlights were out in most areas, leaving the urban landscape in almost complete darkness except for the orange glow of uncontrolled fires. The few remaining radio stations were broadcasting automated emergency messages that repeated the same useless information over and over. The infected people in Lubbock had organized into larger groups than anything we'd observed in rural areas. I saw clusters of 50 or more moving through residential neighborhoods with coordinated purpose. They weren't just wandering randomly anymore. They were conducting systematic searches of every building, every vehicle, every possible hiding place where survivors might have taken shelter. This evolution in their behavior was terrifying to witness. The biological agent that had reanimated them wasn't just preserving motor functions, it was enhancing their ability to work together toward common goals. They communicated through variations in their moaning sounds, shared information about prey locations, and developed hunting strategies that were becoming more sophisticated every day. I couldn't drive through Lubbock without attracting massive attention, so I used my knowledge of the city's industrial infrastructure to find an alternative route. The Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad had maintenance roads that paralleled their main line around the southern edge of the metropolitan area. These roads were designed for track inspection and repair crews, not general traffic, but they would get me past the infected population centers. The railroad route added another hour to my journey, but it gave me my first clear view of how the infection had spread through urban areas. The pattern wasn't random distribution based on population density. The highest concentrations of infected people were clustered around water treatment facilities, municipal buildings, and major intersections of utility infrastructure. This confirmed my suspicions about the outbreak's true origin. Someone had used the infrastructure I'd dedicated my career to protecting as a delivery system for biological warfare. The contamination hadn't started with individual patients who spread the infection through personal contact. It had started with systematic introduction of biological agents into municipal water supplies, using the very systems that were supposed to keep people safe. I stopped at an abandoned railroad maintenance facility to refuel and check my equipment. The building was empty except for tools and spare parts, but it had something more valuable than supplies. It had detailed maps of utility infrastructure throughout West Texas and New Mexico. Maps that showed water treatment plants, power substations, communication nodes, all the critical systems that connected modern civilization. Studying those maps in the light of my portable work lamp, I could see the infection's spread pattern with perfect clarity. Every major outbreak had occurred downstream, from water treatment facilities that processed municipal supplies for multiple communities. The biological agent had been introduced at strategic points, where it could reach maximum population density with minimum initial exposure. This wasn't random terrorism or accidental contamination. This was a carefully planned attack on American infrastructure by someone who understood our utility systems better than most government officials. The perpetrators had probably been working within the industry for years, identifying vulnerabilities and preparing for coordinated strikes against multiple targets simultaneously. The knowledge was almost too horrible to accept. My life's work had been turned into a weapon against the very people I'd sworn to protect. Every pipeline I'd inspected, every water treatment facility I'd certified, every safety protocol I'd helped develop had been analyzed and exploited by enemies who used our own infrastructure to destroy us. But understanding the enemy's strategy also gave me advantages in fighting back. I knew which systems were compromised and which ones might still be safe. I could predict where infected populations would be concentrated and identify routes that avoided the most dangerous areas. Most importantly, I could help military authorities understand what they were really fighting against. The railroad route carried me past several smaller communities that were still showing signs of survivor activity. Brownfield, Leveland, Little Field, places where the infection hadn't achieved complete saturation yet. I could see barricaded buildings, vehicles moving with obvious human purpose, even some functioning streetlights in areas where local power grids were still operational. These communities represented hope for long-term survival, but they also represented time I couldn't afford to spend. Emma's evacuation flight was leaving in less than 18 hours, and I still had over 200 miles to cover. Every minute I spent helping other survivors was a minute closer to losing my daughter forever. Near Leveland, I encountered my first serious mechanical problem. The truck's cooling system had been running hot for the past 50 miles, probably due to debris blocking the radiator intake. I needed to stop and clear the obstruction, but that meant exposing myself in an area where infected people were actively hunting for survivors. I found a cotton gin that had been abandoned since before the outbreak, with loading docks that would give me defensive positions while I worked on the truck. The building was empty except for agricultural equipment, but the infected people had been there recently. I could smell the distinctive odor they carried, a combination of decay and the chemical preservatives that kept their bodies functional. The radiator cleaning took 20 minutes, but those were the longest 20 minutes of my life up to that point. Every sound could have been infected people approaching my position. Every shadow could have hidden an attack that would end my mission before I could reach Emma. The mechanical work required concentration, but survival required constant vigilance against threats that could appear from any direction. While I worked, I noticed something else about the infected people's behavior patterns. They avoided areas with significant chemical contamination, just like we'd observed at the gas station. The cotton gin had agricultural chemical storage tanks that had been leaking for years, creating soil contamination that seemed to repel the infected people. This gave me an idea that would become crucial for reaching Phoenix. Industrial facilities throughout the Southwest used similar chemical storage and processing systems. If I could navigate from one contaminated site to another, I might be able to create a route through areas where infected people were less likely to congregate. It would require precise navigation and detailed knowledge of industrial infrastructure, but those were exactly my areas of expertise. I marked potential waypoints on my maps, identifying chemical plants, refineries, waste treatment facilities, and other industrial sites that might provide safe corridors through infected territory. The route would be longer and more complex than direct highway travel, but it offered better chances of avoiding both infected people and hostile survivors who controlled traditional transportation routes. The truck ran smoothly after the radiator repair, but I'd lost valuable time and was now behind schedule for reaching Phoenix before Emma's evacuation. I needed to make up time without taking unnecessary risks, which meant pushing the truck harder, while staying alert for threats that could appear without warning. South of Leveland, I encountered the largest group of infected people I'd seen so far. At least 200 individuals moving across open farmland in a loose formation that suggested coordinated hunting behavior. They weren't responding to any immediate stimulus, just conducting a systematic search of the area for any signs of living humans. The scale of the group was terrifying, but their behavior was even more disturbing. They moved with purpose and organization, like a military unit conducting reconnaissance in hostile territory. Some individuals acted as scouts, ranging ahead of the main group to investigate potential threats or opportunities. Others maintained formation discipline, staying within communication range of the larger unit. The biological agent wasn't just reanimating dead tissue and preserving motor functions. It was creating a collective intelligence that improved the infected people's effectiveness as predators. They were learning from experience, sharing information across individuals, and developing strategies that became more sophisticated over time. I waited until the group passed before continuing south toward the New Mexico border. The delay cost me another hour, but engaging that many infected people would have been suicide. Even with all my weapons and defensive preparations, I couldn't have survived direct confrontation with 200 coordinated attackers. The border crossing into New Mexico should have been routine, but I discovered that state authorities had attempted to establish quarantine checkpoints before being overrun by infected people. The abandoned roadblock was littered with official vehicles, military equipment, and evidence of a battle that the living had lost decisively. Among the debris, I found something that changed my understanding of the outbreak's timeline. Official documents dated October 12th, 3 days before the emergency broadcasts I'd heard in Texas. The infection had been spreading through New Mexico for at least a week before authorities in other states realized what was happening. The simultaneous outbreaks I'd witnessed weren't really simultaneous at all. They were the result of coordinated contamination that had been developing across multiple states for days or weeks. This meant the perpetrators had much more preparation time than anyone realized. They'd been introducing biological agents into water systems across the Southwest, while authorities were still debating whether the initial reports represented isolated incidents or coordinated attacks. By the time emergency services recognized the scope of the threat, the infection had already reached critical mass in dozens of population centers. I also found military communication equipment that was still receiving transmissions from Phoenix. The evacuation operation was proceeding on schedule, but aircraft capacity was limited, and priority was being given to essential personnel. Families with children were guaranteed placement, but only if they reached designated pickup points before departure deadlines. Emma qualified for evacuation because of her age, but Jennifer might not make the cutoff if too many other families arrived at the airport. I needed to reach Phoenix in time to ensure both of them got on the evacuation flights, which meant covering the remaining 150 miles in less than 12 hours. The abandoned checkpoint also provided me with additional fuel and military-grade equipment that would be useful for the final approach to Phoenix. Night vision goggles, portable radios, even some explosives that might be necessary for clearing obstacles or creating diversions. The soldiers who died defending this position had been well equipped, but they'd been overwhelmed by sheer numbers of infected attackers. As I loaded the military supplies into my truck, I realized that I was probably one of the last people who would make this journey. The routes I was using would soon be discovered by infected people or blocked by hostile survivors. The window of opportunity for individual travel across infected territory was closing rapidly, and I might be among the final evacuees to reach Phoenix before the military abandoned the operation. The radio chatter from Phoenix was becoming more urgent and desperate with each transmission. Aircraft were arriving on schedule, but ground crews were reporting increasing pressure from infected people who were converging on the airport from all directions. The evacuation operation was turning into a race between rescue flights and the growing zombie army that threatened to overrun the entire facility. Emma was somewhere in that chaos, waiting for me to fulfill the promise I'd made when I left the gas station. Jennifer was there too, probably wondering if her desperate radio call had reached me in time. I had less than 10 hours to cross 150 miles of increasingly dangerous territory, then somehow penetrate the infected. Crowds surrounding Sky Harbor Airport. The truck's engine was running smoothly, my fuel supplies were adequate, and I had enough weapons and ammunition to handle normal threats. But normal had stopped existing 5 days ago when the world ended at 10:30 in the morning. Now I was driving through a landscape where the dead walked and the living fought each other for scraps of a civilization that was never coming back. The infected people were evolving faster than anyone had predicted. The hostile survivors were becoming more organized and dangerous. The infrastructure I'd spent my career maintaining was failing systematically as power grids collapsed and communication networks went silent. Everything that had made my previous life possible was disappearing, leaving only the most primitive struggle for survival. But Emma was still alive, still waiting for her father to prove that he could be the man she needed. When everything else failed, that was the only thing that mattered now. That was the only reason to keep driving through the darkness toward a city that might already be lost. The approach to Phoenix revealed the true scale of what we were facing. From 20 miles away, I could see the glow of fires consuming entire neighborhoods, while columns of smoke rose into the desert sky like funeral pyres for a dead civilization. The interstate system that should have carried me directly to Sky Harbor Airport was completely impassable, clogged with abandoned vehicles and infected people who moved between them in coordinated hunting packs. I'd been monitoring military radio frequencies since crossing into Arizona, and the situation reports painted a picture of total systematic collapse. Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport was still operational, but barely. Ground crews were reporting infected people massing in the thousands around the perimeter, drawn by the sound of aircraft engines and the concentration of living humans within the terminal buildings. The evacuation flights were departing on schedule, but each departure window was becoming more dangerous as infected populations converged on the airport from every direction. Military estimates suggested they had maybe 6 hours before the facility would be completely overrun. After that, no additional aircraft would be able to land safely, and anyone still waiting for evacuation would be trapped with no possibility of rescue. Jennifer's last radio transmission had been 8 hours ago, confirming that she and Emma were still at Gate B12 in Terminal 4. Since then, radio traffic from the airport had become increasingly fragmented and desperate. Ground control was reporting communication failures, power outages in several terminal sections, and breaches in the security perimeter that were being contained only through continuous military action. I had to assume Emma was still alive and still waiting for evacuation, but I also had to accept that the airport might be overrun before I could reach her. The infected people weren't just randomly wandering toward the sound of aircraft. They were displaying coordinated behavior that suggested they understood the airport represented a concentration of human prey that was worth sustained effort to capture. My original plan had been to approach Phoenix through industrial corridors where infected populations would be lower, but the scale of the infestation made that strategy impossible. Every route into the metropolitan area was compromised by massive numbers of infected people who had spread far beyond the original population centers. The biological agent that created them wasn't just reanimating individual corpses, it was creating a collective intelligence that improved their effectiveness as hunters. The abandoned railroad maintenance facility where I'd studied infrastructure maps had given me one crucial piece of information. Phoenix had an extensive network of utility tunnels that connected major buildings, water treatment facilities, and power distribution centers. These tunnels were designed for maintenance access and emergency services, not general transportation. but they might provide a route to the airport that avoided surface-level infected populations. The main entrance to the tunnel system was located at a water treatment plant on the southwestern edge of the city. If I could reach that facility, I might be able to navigate underground to within a few miles of Sky Harbor Airport. The risk was enormous because tunnels would limit my escape options if I encountered infected people in confined spaces. But surface routes were guaranteed suicide against the numbers I was observing. As I drove toward the water treatment plant, I began to understand the true scope of the infrastructure attack that had caused this outbreak. The facility I was approaching had been one of the contamination points where biological agents were introduced into Phoenix's municipal water supply. The perpetrators had used my own industry's protocols and procedures to deliver weapons of mass destruction through systems that were supposed to protect public health. Whoever planned this attack had intimate knowledge of water treatment processes, distribution network vulnerabilities, and the chemical interactions that would preserve biological agents during processing and transportation. They'd probably spent years infiltrating the infrastructure industry, identifying targets and preparing for coordinated strikes against multiple cities simultaneously. The water treatment plant was surrounded by infected people who seemed drawn to the location for reasons I didn't immediately understand. Hundreds of them wandered through the facility grounds with mechanical persistence, investigating every building and structure as if searching for something specific. Their behavior suggested they retained enough memory to associate the location with their transformation from living humans into reanimated predators. Getting into the tunnel system required crossing an open area where infected people would immediately detect my presence. I needed a distraction that would draw them away from the entrance long enough for me to reach underground access points. The plant's chemical storage tanks provided the solution I needed, but implementing it would require precise timing and considerable risk. I parked my truck near the facility's main gate and used military explosives from the abandoned checkpoint to rig one of the chlorine storage tanks. The explosion would create a chemical cloud that infected people seemed to avoid, while also producing noise and light that would attract their attention. If my timing was correct, I'd have maybe 10 minutes to reach the tunnel entrance before they returned to investigate the area. The explosion was visible from miles away, sending a massive plume of chlorinated gas into the desert air while infected people throughout the facility grounds moved toward the disturbance with coordinated purpose. I used their momentary distraction to sprint across open ground to the utility building that housed the main tunnel access point. The tunnel entrance was protected by heavy steel doors that required both mechanical keys and electronic access codes. Fortunately, my security clearance for pipeline inspection included reciprocal access to municipal utility systems. The codes I'd been using for 12 years still worked, proving that infrastructure security protocols had been maintained even as the surface world collapsed into chaos. Descending into Phoenix's utility tunnel system was like entering a tomb that extended for miles beneath the dead city. The tunnels were designed to carry water mains, electrical conduits, and communication cables between major facilities throughout the metropolitan area. Emergency lighting still functioned in most sections, powered by backup generators that were designed to operate independently for weeks during crisis situations. But the tunnels weren't empty. The infected people had found their way into the underground system, probably through damaged access points or maintenance entrances that weren't properly secured. I could hear their moaning sounds echoing through concrete corridors, making it impossible to determine their exact locations or numbers. The acoustics of the tunnel system amplified and distorted sound in ways that turned every noise into a potential threat. Navigation required constant reference to infrastructure maps that showed the complex network of interconnected passages beneath Phoenix. The main tunnel ran east toward downtown, with secondary branches that connected to government buildings, hospitals, major hotels, and eventually the airport terminal complex. But many sections were flooded with contaminated water that had backed up from the treatment plant, creating pools of biological hazard that could cause infection through skin contact. My chemical analysis equipment confirmed what I'd suspected about the contamination. The biological agent that created infected people was remarkably stable in aquatic environments. It could survive for weeks in standing water, remaining infectious to anyone who came into contact with it. The tunnel system wasn't just a route to the airport. It was a reservoir of biological contamination that would pose threats for months or years after the initial outbreak. Progress through the tunnels was slow and dangerous, requiring constant vigilance against infected people who could appear from any direction without warning. The confined spaces amplified every advantage they possessed while limiting my ability to maneuver or escape. In open areas, I could outrun them or use superior positioning to avoid confrontation. In narrow tunnels, any encounter would result in close-quarters combat with creatures that felt no pain and never tired. The first major obstacle came at a junction where 3 tunnel branches converged near downtown Phoenix. The intersection was flooded with 3 feet of contaminated water that contained floating debris and what appeared to be human remains in various stages of decomposition. Crossing the flooded section would require wading through biological contamination that could cause infection through any open wound or prolonged skin exposure. I used plastic sheeting and chemical tape from my emergency supplies to create protective clothing that would minimize contact with contaminated water. The crossing took 15 minutes of careful movement through debris that included infected body parts still capable of transmitting the biological agent. Every step could have resulted in exposure that would transform me into one of the creatures I was trying to avoid. On the far side of the flooded intersection, I discovered evidence that other survivors had attempted to use the tunnel system for evacuation. Personal belongings, emergency supplies, even some weapons and ammunition scattered along the tunnel floor. But no survivors. Whatever had happened to them, they hadn't made it to the airport alive. The abandoned equipment included military-grade communication devices that were still receiving transmissions from Sky Harbor Airport. The situation above ground was deteriorating rapidly. Infected people had breached the airport's outer security perimeter and were conducting coordinated attacks against terminal entrances. Military units were falling back to defensive positions around the aircraft loading areas, abandoning large sections of the terminal complex to infected occupation. Emma and Jennifer were somewhere in that chaos, assuming they were still alive. Terminal 4 was still under military control, but reports indicated that infected people were infiltrating the building through maintenance access points and service corridors. The same tunnel system I was using to reach the airport was also providing routes for infected people to bypass surface defenses. I increased my pace through the remaining tunnel sections, but encountered my most dangerous obstacle near the airport approach. A section of tunnel had collapsed, probably due to structural damage from the ongoing crisis above ground. The debris blocked most of the passage, leaving only a narrow crawl space that would force me into extremely vulnerable positioning while navigating past the obstruction. Worse, the collapsed section was occupied by infected people who had been trapped by the cave-in but remained active and dangerous. I could see them moving through gaps in the debris, responding to my presence with increased agitation and that horrible moaning sound that served as their communication system. Getting past them would require precise timing and considerable luck. I used my remaining explosives to create additional collapse that would seal the infected people into their section of debris while opening a passage I could navigate. The explosion was successful in clearing my route, but it also announced my presence to every infected person within miles of the airport. The sound would draw them toward my location with coordinated purpose, eliminating any element of surprise I might have retained. The final stretch of tunnel ran directly beneath Sky Harbor Airport's Terminal 4, connecting to basement levels that housed mechanical systems and emergency services. I could hear aircraft engines above my head, indicating that evacuation flights were still departing on schedule. But I could also hear other sounds that confirmed infected people had infiltrated the terminal building. Emergency lighting in the airport basement was intermittent, powered by backup systems that were beginning to fail after days of continuous operation. Some sections were completely dark, forcing me to rely on portable lighting that could attract infected people from considerable distances. Every step forward increased the chances of detection, while bringing me closer to Emma's location. The basement level connected to service elevators that provided access to the passenger terminal areas. According to my infrastructure maps, Gate B12 was located on the second floor of Terminal 4, directly above the main baggage handling system. If the elevators were still operational, I could reach Emma's location within minutes. If not, I'd have to find alternative routes through a building that was being systematically invaded by infected people. The first elevator I tried was dead. Its mechanical systems probably damaged by power fluctuations or deliberate sabotage. The second elevator was functional but produced mechanical noise that would announce my presence to infected people throughout the basement level. Using it would be fast but dangerous, alerting every threat in the immediate area to my exact location. I decided the risk was acceptable because speed was now more important than stealth. Every minute I spent in the basement was another minute closer to total collapse of the evacuation operation. Emma's flight could depart at any moment, leaving her stranded in a terminal building that was being overrun by infected people who had learned to hunt in coordinated groups. The elevator ride to the second floor was the longest 90 seconds of my life. Any floor could have opened to reveal infected people who would overwhelm my defensive position before I could react. The mechanical noise of the elevator would attract their attention throughout the terminal, creating a situation where I'd be surrounded by hostile forces with limited escape options. When the doors opened on the second floor, I found myself looking at a scene from the worst kind of nightmare. The passenger terminal was in chaos, with military personnel conducting fighting retreats while civilian evacuees crowded around departure gates. Infected people had infiltrated the building through multiple access points and were advancing through the concourse with coordinated determination. Gate B12 was visible across the terminal, but reaching it would require crossing open areas where infected people were actively hunting for human prey. Military forces were providing covering fire for civilian evacuees, but their ammunition was limited, and their positions were being systematically overrun by sheer numbers of attackers. Emma was somewhere in that chaos, probably terrified, and wondering if her father would arrive in time to save her. Jennifer was there too, trying to keep their daughter safe while emergency services collapsed around them. I had maybe minutes before the entire terminal would be lost to infected occupation. The sound of aircraft engines was constant now, indicating that evacuation flights were departing as rapidly as possible, while ground conditions still permitted safe takeoffs. But each departure reduced the total capacity available for remaining evacuees. If I didn't reach Emma soon, there might not be any aircraft left to carry her to safety. I checked my weapons and ammunition one final time, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether my week-long journey had any meaning. Everything I'd learned about survival, infrastructure, and the infected people's behavior patterns would be tested in the most dangerous environment I'd encountered since leaving the gas station. The distance to gate B12 was maybe 200 yards, but those would be the most important 200 yards of my life. Between me and my daughter were infected people who had evolved into efficient predators, military personnel who might mistake me for a threat, and the constant possibility that Emma's evacuation flight would depart before I could reach her. But I'd come too far to fail now. Emma was counting on me to be the father I'd never managed to be during 12 years of choosing work over family. This was my chance to prove that when everything else failed, when civilization collapsed and the dead walked the earth, her father would still find a way to protect her. The infected people in the terminal had noticed my arrival and were beginning to converge on my position with that horrible coordinated purpose I'd observed throughout my journey. But they were too late to stop me now. I was going to reach my daughter, and we were going to survive this nightmare together. The terminal concourse had become a battlefield where the living fought desperately against an enemy that felt no pain and never retreated. Military personnel were conducting organized withdrawals toward the aircraft loading areas, while infected people advanced through passenger seating areas with coordinated determination. The sound of gunfire mixed with aircraft engines and that horrible moaning chorus that served as communication between the infected. I identified the quickest route to gate B12 by using my knowledge of airport infrastructure to navigate through service corridors that paralleled the main concourse. These maintenance passages were designed for baggage handling and emergency services, not passenger traffic, but they provided cover from both infected people and military crossfire. The risk was encountering infected people in confined spaces where my movement options would be severely limited. The first service corridor was clear except for abandoned equipment and personal belongings left by airport staff, who'd fled when the infected people began infiltrating the terminal. Emergency lighting was still functional, powered by backup generators that were designed to operate independently during crisis situations. But I could hear movement in adjacent corridors, indicating that infected people had discovered these routes and were using them to bypass military defensive positions. My portable radio was receiving continuous transmissions from evacuation control, coordinating aircraft departures with ground security operations. The situation was deteriorating faster than anyone had anticipated. Infected people weren't just attacking randomly anymore. They were displaying tactical intelligence that suggested the biological agent was enhancing their cognitive abilities rather than simply reanimating dead tissue. Gate B12 was located in a section of Terminal 4 that was still under military control, but barely. The defensive perimeter was contracting as infected people overwhelmed individual positions through sheer numbers and coordinated attacks. Military units were reporting ammunition shortages, communication failures, and casualties that reduced their effectiveness with each engagement. I reached a maintenance area that overlooked the gate area through service windows designed for cleaning and repair access. Below me, I could see civilian evacuees crowded around departure gates while military personnel maintained defensive positions at corridor entrances. The scene was organized chaos, with families clutching emergency bags while children cried and adults argued about priority boarding procedures. Then I saw them. Jennifer and Emma were seated near Gate B12, surrounded by other families waiting for evacuation flights. Emma looked smaller and more vulnerable than I remembered, wearing a backpack that probably contained everything she'd been able to save from her normal life. Jennifer was holding her close, constantly scanning the terminal for threats while trying to maintain calm for their daughter's sake. They were alive. After 6 days of traveling through infected territory, fighting through hostile survivors and navigating underground tunnel systems, my family was still alive and waiting for rescue. But the evacuation aircraft at their gate was nearly full, and boarding announcements indicated departure was imminent. I had maybe 10 minutes to reach them before their flight left without me. The service corridor that connected to their gate area was occupied by infected people who had infiltrated through baggage handling systems. I could see at least 8 individuals moving through the narrow passage with mechanical persistence, investigating every alcove and maintenance access point. Engaging them in confined spaces would require close quarters combat that could result in infection through bite wounds or blood contact. I used my remaining military explosives to create a distraction that would draw the infected people away from the corridor I needed to traverse. The explosion occurred in a baggage sorting area, producing noise and vibration that attracted their attention, while creating chemical smoke that seemed to repel them. The diversion gave me approximately 5 minutes to reach the gate area before they returned to investigate my location. Fighting my way through the terminal required every survival skill I'd developed during 12 years of working in dangerous environments. The infected people moved with coordinated purpose, but they still retained the slow, deliberate movement patterns I'd observed throughout my journey. Superior positioning and careful timing allowed me to avoid most confrontations while making steady progress toward Emma's location. The military personnel at Gate B12 initially treated me as a potential threat, raising weapons and demanding identification before allowing me to approach the civilian evacuation area. My pipeline inspector credentials and knowledge of infrastructure systems convinced them I was legitimate, but precious minutes were lost while they verified my identity and intentions. When Emma saw me approaching through the crowd of evacuees, her face transformed from fear to relief to joy in a matter of seconds. She broke away from Jennifer and ran toward me with complete trust that her father would protect her from whatever nightmare had consumed their world. The embrace lasted, maybe 10 seconds, but it erased 12 years of missed opportunities and failed responsibilities. Jennifer's reaction was more complex, mixing gratitude with lingering resentment about our failed marriage and my absence from Emma's life. But the crisis had stripped away petty concerns about custody, arrangements, and financial obligations. We were a family again, united by the simple goal of surviving long enough to escape the infected city. The boarding announcement for their evacuation flight came over the terminal address system while we were still reuniting. Priority was being given to families with children, essential personnel, and individuals with critical technical skills. Emma qualified because of her age, but Jennifer and I would need to compete for remaining seats with other adult evacuees. I explained my knowledge of infrastructure systems and the contamination patterns that had caused the outbreak. Military personnel were immediately interested in my information about water treatment facilities, pipeline networks, and the coordination required for simultaneous attacks across multiple states. My debriefing would have to wait until we reached the evacuation destination, but my technical expertise guaranteed passage on the aircraft. The final boarding process was conducted under military escort, as infected people began breaching the gate area defenses. We could hear gunfire getting closer while passengers filed onto the aircraft with whatever belongings they could carry. Personal possessions that had seemed important a week ago were abandoned in favor of survival essentials and family photographs. Emma held my hand during the boarding process, asking questions about what would happen next and whether we'd be safe at the evacuation destination. I gave her honest answers about the uncertainty we faced while reassuring her that staying together was the most important thing. The world she'd known was gone, but her family was intact and committed to protecting her future. The aircraft departure was the most dangerous part of the evacuation process. Infected people had surrounded the runway area and were attempting to reach the aircraft through coordinated attacks on ground crew positions. Military units provided covering fire, while the pilots conducted emergency takeoff procedures designed to minimize exposure time on the ground. As we climbed away from Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport, I could see the full scope of the disaster that had consumed the metropolitan area. Fires were burning throughout the city while infected people moved through abandoned neighborhoods in massive groups. The infrastructure I'd spent my career maintaining was failing systematically as power grids collapsed and water systems became contaminated beyond repair. The flight to Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado took 3 hours, during which military personnel conducted preliminary debriefings with evacuees who had useful information about the outbreak's development and spread patterns. My knowledge of contamination timelines and infrastructure vulnerabilities was particularly valuable for understanding how the biological attack had been coordinated across multiple states. The evacuation destination was a temporary refugee camp that housed thousands of survivors from infected areas throughout the Southwest. Military authorities were attempting to establish sustainable communities while conducting research into the biological agent that had caused the outbreak. The goal was eventual recovery and reconstruction, but the timeline for return to normal civilization was completely uncertain. Emma adapted to refugee camp life with remarkable resilience, making friends with other children who'd lost their homes and attending makeshift schools organized by volunteer teachers. Jennifer found work with medical personnel who were treating evacuees for various health problems related to their escape from infected areas. We were assigned family housing that was basic but adequate for our immediate needs. My role in the camp involved consulting with military engineers and infrastructure specialists who were planning for long-term survival and eventual reconstruction efforts. The knowledge I'd gained about contamination patterns and infrastructure vulnerabilities was being used to design safer systems that would be less susceptible to similar attacks in the future. But the most important aspect of camp life was the opportunity to rebuild my relationship with Emma without the distractions and excuses that had kept me away from her during normal times. We spent hours talking about her experiences during the outbreak, her fears about the future, and her understanding of how the world had changed. She was remarkably mature for 12 years old, probably because the crisis had forced her to confront realities that most children never have to consider. Jennifer and I also had conversations about our relationship and the possibility of reconciliation. The outbreak had changed both of us in ways that made our previous conflicts seem trivial. We'd both learned that family connections were more important than career achievements or personal grudges. Whether we could build a sustainable relationship remained to be seen, but we were committed to providing Emma with stability during uncertain times. The refugee camp received regular reports about conditions in infected areas throughout the country. The outbreak had spread far beyond the Southwest, consuming major population centers on both coasts, while isolated communities struggled to maintain quarantine procedures. The biological agent showed no signs of natural degradation, and infected people continued to display increasing coordination and tactical intelligence. My debriefings with military authorities revealed the full scope of the infrastructure attack that had caused the outbreak. The perpetrators had been working within water treatment and pipeline industries for years, identifying vulnerabilities and preparing for coordinated strikes against critical systems. The attack had been designed to cause maximum casualties while crippling the infrastructure necessary for emergency response and recovery efforts. The investigation was ongoing, but initial evidence suggested involvement by domestic terrorist groups with extensive technical knowledge and inside access to utility systems. The attack represented a new form of warfare that used civilian infrastructure as a delivery system for biological weapons. Defending against similar attacks would require fundamental changes in how we design and operate critical systems. Recovery efforts were being planned based on the assumption that infected areas would remain dangerous for months or years. The biological agent showed remarkable stability in various environmental conditions, and infected people were proving to be more durable and intelligent than anyone had initially expected. Reclaiming contaminated territory would require military operations supported by extensive technological resources. But there were also encouraging reports from isolated communities that had successfully maintained quarantine procedures and avoided contamination. These survivor settlements were developing innovative solutions for food production, power generation, and communication that could serve as models for broader reconstruction efforts. Human civilization wasn't ending, but it was being transformed by the crisis in ways that would permanently change how we organize society. Emma often asked me about the gas station where I'd stayed before reaching Phoenix, wondering what had happened to Frank, Sarah, and Carlos. I'd attempted radio contact with their location several times since arriving at the refugee camp, but received no response. Whether they were still alive and maintaining radio silence for security reasons, or had been overrun by infected people, remained unknown. The uncertainty about their fate reminded me that my survival had depended on the help and sacrifice of many people who deserved better outcomes than the crisis had provided. The hostile survivors who'd controlled roadblocks, the infected people who'd retained enough humanity to recognize their own tragedy, the military personnel who'd died defending evacuation operations, all of them had contributed to my ability to reach Emma in time. My week-long journey from Pipeline Station 7 to Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport had covered 300 miles of infected territory, but it had also transformed me from an isolated technician into someone who understood the importance of human connections. The infrastructure knowledge that had made the journey possible was valuable, but the relationships I'd formed and preserved were what gave that knowledge meaning. The refugee camp was temporary, but the community we were building there represented hope for eventual recovery and reconstruction. Emma would grow up in a world very different from the one she'd known before the outbreak, but she'd also grow up understanding the importance of family, community, and the technical knowledge necessary to maintain civilization under adverse conditions. My role as a technical consultant was expanding to include training programs for other survivors who needed to understand infrastructure systems and contamination procedures. The knowledge I'd gained during 12 years of pipeline inspection was being used to educate the next generation of engineers and technicians who would rebuild our country from refugee camps and isolated settlements. The woman in the business suit whom I'd encountered on Highway 349 was probably still walking through the Texas desert, joined by thousands of others who'd been transformed by the biological attack. They represented a permanent threat that would require ongoing vigilance and military action, but they also represented the failure of systems I'd sworn to protect and the consequences of not recognizing warning signs when they first appeared. Every night in the refugee camp, I thought about the chemical readings I'd dismissed as equipment malfunction and the contamination reports I'd filed as routine paperwork. The outbreak could have been prevented if someone had connected the right information at the right time. That knowledge was a burden I'd carry for the rest of my life, but it was also motivation to ensure similar failures never happened again. Emma was sleeping soundly in the bunk next to mine, finally safe from the infected people who'd consumed her hometown and threatened her evacuation. Jennifer was working late in the medical facility, treating other refugees who'd suffered injuries and trauma during their escape from infected areas. We were together. We were alive. And we had the opportunity to build something better from the ruins of our previous world. The radio was quiet, except for routine communications between refugee camps and military units. The emergency broadcasts that had marked the beginning of the outbreak were no longer necessary, because everyone who could be warned had already been reached. The New World was establishing its own communication patterns and organizational structures that would eventually replace the systems we'd lost. My pipeline inspector credentials were meaningless now, but the knowledge they represented had become more valuable than ever. Understanding infrastructure, recognizing system failures, maintaining critical equipment under adverse conditions, these skills would be essential for rebuilding civilization in a world where the infected people would remain a permanent threat. The week that began with routine pipeline inspection had ended with the collapse of modern civilization and the beginning of something entirely new. Emma would inherit a world where survival required both technical knowledge and strong community connections. My job was to ensure she had both, and to help build the infrastructure that would support her generation's efforts to reclaim the future from the infected remnants of our past.